I remember the night I saw the leprechaun like it was yesterday. It was a chilly evening in early spring, and I had just finished working my shift at the diner. I was walking home through the quiet streets, lost in my thoughts when I heard a strange noise behind me. I turned around to see a small figure darting across the road. At first, I thought it was just a child playing a prank, but as it got closer, I realized that it was not human. It was a leprechaun. I froze in fear as it approached me. Its beady eyes stared into mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was dressed in green and had a wild mane of red hair that seemed to glow in the moonlight. Its pointed ears were twitching, and it had a sly grin on its face. I tried to back away, but the leprechaun followed me, moving quickly and nimbly. It spoke in a language that I couldn't understand, but its voice was deep and menacing. I felt as though it was trying to lure me into some kind of trap. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the leprechaun's footsteps behind me, its laughter echoing through the streets. I felt like it was toying with me, teasing me, and playing with me like a cat plays with a mouse. I didn't stop running until I reached my front door, and I slammed it shut behind me. I locked every lock, and I sat in the darkness, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it was all just a nightmare, but the memory of the leprechaun's face and voice haunted me for weeks. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching me, waiting for its chance to strike. I never spoke about the encounter to anyone, fearing that they would think I was crazy. But every time I walk home alone at night, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, wondering if the leprechaun is still lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. So if you're ever walking alone on a quiet night, and you hear strange noises behind you, be careful. You never know what kind of creatures might be out there, waiting to pounce. I never believed in leprechauns, that is until I saw one with my own two eyes. It was a few years back, on St. Patrick's Day, a night I will never forget. I was walking home from a friend's party, feeling a bit tipsy but still able to walk straight. The streets were deserted, and the only sounds were the rustling of trees and my own footsteps. Suddenly, I heard a faint giggle, and I stopped in my tracks, wondering if it was just my imagination. I looked around and saw a small figure darting behind a tree. At first, I thought it was a child, but as I approached, I realized it was too small to be a human. It was a leprechaun, with its red beard and pointy hat. I froze in terror, unsure of what to do. The leprechaun giggled again and started to run away, beckoning me to follow. I was scared, but I couldn't resist the urge to chase the little creature. The leprechaun led me to a nearby park, where it disappeared into the bushes. I followed, and that's when things got really scary. The bushes rustled, and I heard whispers in the dark. I tried to run, but I was rooted to the spot. Suddenly, the leprechaun reappeared, this time with a sinister grin on its face. It offered me a deal, a pot of gold in exchange for my soul. I tried to refuse, but the leprechaun was persistent, and I felt its eyes boring into me. I don't know how I managed to escape, but I woke up the next morning in my bed, with no memory of how I got there. I thought it was just a dream, but when I reached for my phone, I saw a text message from an unknown number. It was a picture of me sleeping, taken from my own phone. The message read, "I'll be seeing you soon." From that day on, I never walked alone at night, and I never celebrated St. Patrick's Day again. I don't know what the leprechaun wanted, but I do know that it was the scariest encounter of my life. I never believed in leprechauns until I saw one for myself. It was a warm spring evening, and I had just finished my shift at the local pub. I was walking home, taking my usual shortcut through the woods, when I heard a rustling in the bushes. At first, I thought it was just a small animal, but then I saw him. He was no more than 2 feet tall, dressed in green from head to toe. His eyes were black as coal, and he had a crooked smile that sent shivers down my spine. I froze in fear as he approached me, his high-pitched voice ringing in my ears. "Top o' the mornin' to ya," he said, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. I tried to back away, but he was too quick. He grabbed me by the ankle, and I fell to the ground, my head hitting a rock. As I lay there, dazed and confused, he began to circle me, his eyes never leaving mine. "You found me, pot of gold," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "And now you must pay the price." I closed my eyes, expecting the worst, but when I opened them again, he was gone. I stumbled to my feet and ran all the way home, my heart pounding in my chest. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that twisted smile, heard that grating voice. I even went to see a therapist, but he just told me I was suffering from PTSD. But I know what I saw. I know that leprechauns are real, and that they're not the friendly creatures we see in movies and on St. Patrick's Day. They're ancient beings, with powers beyond our comprehension, and they're not to be trifled with. So if you ever find yourself walking through the woods on a warm spring evening, keep your eyes peeled. You never know what you might find, or what might find you. I'm not sure if anyone will believe me, but I swear to you that what I experienced was real. I was on a hiking trip in the Irish countryside with my friends, enjoying the beautiful scenery and the fresh air. We had set up camp near a small stream and were cooking dinner over the fire when we heard a strange noise. At first, we thought it was just an animal, but the noise continued and grew louder. That's when I saw it, a small figure about 3 feet tall, with a green hat and suit. It looked like a leprechaun straight out of a fairy tale. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but my friends saw it too. We all froze, staring at the creature in shock. Suddenly, the leprechaun started to speak. Its voice was high-pitched and raspy, like an old man's. It said something in a language we couldn't understand, then it started to walk towards us. We all backed away slowly, not sure what to do. As the leprechaun got closer, we could see its face more clearly. Its eyes were dark and piercing, and its grin was twisted and menacing. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, not cute and friendly like the leprechauns in children's stories, but something altogether more sinister. We turned and ran, leaving our campsite and all our gear behind. We didn't stop until we were miles away, out of breath and exhausted. We didn't speak about what had happened until we were back in the safety of our homes. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear on my life that it was real. I don't know what that leprechaun wanted from us, but I do know that I never want to see it again. If you're ever hiking in the Irish countryside and you hear a strange noise, be careful, you never know what kind of creatures are out there, waiting to scare you out of your wits. I never believed in leprechauns, or any other mythical creature for that matter. But one night, a few years ago, I had an encounter that changed everything. It was a typical evening in March. I was out for a walk in the woods near my house, enjoying the crisp air and the beauty of the forest. I had been walking for about half an hour when I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a rabbit or a squirrel, but as I got closer, I realized that it was something much stranger. It was a small figure, about the size of a child, with bright red hair and a green hat. It was hopping around in the underbrush, looking for something. As I got closer, the figure turned and looked at me. Its eyes were the color of gold, and they seemed to sparkle in the moonlight. For a moment, I froze, unsure of what to do. Then, the figure spoke. "Top of the evening to you," it said, in a high-pitched voice that sounded like it came from another world. I was terrified, but I managed to stammer out a greeting in response. The figure introduced itself as a leprechaun, and explained that it was searching for its pot of gold, which had been stolen by a band of mischievous fairies. I didn't know what to believe, but I could see that the figure was genuinely upset. It begged me to help it find its gold, promising me a reward if I succeeded. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should trust this strange creature. But then, I remembered the stories I had heard about leprechauns and their magical powers. Maybe, just maybe, this was my chance to experience something truly extraordinary. I agreed to help the leprechaun, and we set off into the woods together. It was a long and difficult journey, but eventually, we came to a clearing where a group of fairies were gathered around a glittering pile of gold coins. The leprechaun charged into the fray, wielding a small sword and shouting battle cries. I hung back, watching in awe as the tiny figures fought with incredible ferocity. In the end, the leprechaun emerged victorious. The fairies fled into the night, leaving the gold behind. The leprechaun was overjoyed, and it rewarded me with a handful of coins as a token of its gratitude. As I walked home that night, clutching my newfound treasure, I knew that my life would never be the same. I had seen things that I never thought were possible, and I had encountered a creature that I had always believed to be nothing more than a myth. Now, whenever I walk in the woods at night, I keep an eye out for that bright red hair and green hat. Who knows what other magical beings are lurking just out of sight, waiting for their chance to reveal themselves. I was out for a walk in the woods near my house one evening when I saw something that still gives me chills to this day. It was a leprechaun. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I could see that it was real. It was only about 2 feet tall, with bright red hair and a green jacket. Its eyes were a piercing shade of blue that seemed to glow in the dim light of the woods. I froze in my tracks, unsure of what to do. I had always heard stories about leprechauns and their love of gold, and I didn't want to risk angering it. But as I stood there, the leprechaun turned to me and smiled. "Good evening, traveler," it said in a voice that sounded like bells ringing. "What brings you to my woods?" I was too scared to answer, but the leprechaun didn't seem to mind. Instead, it walked up to me and held out a small pot of gold coins. "I see you're interested in my treasure," it said. "Would you like to take a closer look?" I hesitated for a moment before nodding my head. The leprechaun handed me the pot of gold, and I felt the weight of it in my hands. I could hardly believe that I was holding something so valuable. But as I looked up, the leprechaun had disappeared. In its place was a cold wind that seemed to chill me to the bone. I knew that I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. I turned and ran as fast as I could, holding onto the pot of gold as tightly as possible. When I finally reached the edge of the woods, I collapsed onto the ground, panting and gasping for air. That's when I heard the laughter. It was high-pitched and maniacal, like it was coming from a madman. I looked up to see the leprechaun standing at the edge of the woods, holding out its arms and cackling. I knew that I needed to get out of there as fast as possible. I stood up, still clutching the pot of gold, and ran as fast as I could. When I finally made it back to my house, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch. I still have the pot of gold to this day, but I know that I will never forget that leprechaun sighting. And I will never go back into those woods again. I had heard the stories before, about leprechauns and their mischievous ways, but I never thought I would have an encounter with one myself. It all started one night when I was out walking my dog. It was a warm spring evening, and I decided to take a different route than usual, just to mix things up a bit. As we walked down the deserted street, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. It was a small figure, about 3 feet tall, darting across the street. At first, I thought it might be a child playing a prank, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. The creature was dressed in green, with a pointy hat and a bushy beard. Its eyes were a bright emerald green, and they seemed to sparkle in the moonlight. I couldn't believe my eyes, it was a leprechaun. I froze in place, not sure what to do. The leprechaun seemed to be just as surprised to see me as I was to see him. He looked up at me with a mischievous grin on his face, and I could tell he was up to something. Suddenly, he darted off again, disappearing into the darkness. I tried to follow him, but he was too quick for me. I decided to head back home, feeling a bit spooked by the encounter. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. My dog refused to go for walks anymore, and I began hearing strange noises coming from my backyard. One night, I woke up to find my bed shaking violently, as if someone was trying to wake me up. I couldn't take it anymore, I had to find out what was going on. I went to the local library and began researching leprechauns. It turns out, they are known for their tricks and pranks, and they are not to be taken lightly. I decided to try and confront the leprechaun, hoping to put an end to the strange occurrences in my life. I went back to the spot where I had first seen him and waited, hoping he would show up. Sure enough, he did. This time, I was ready for him. I confronted him, demanding to know what he wanted from me. The leprechaun just laughed, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "I just wanted to have a bit of fun," he said, his voice sounding like 1,000 tiny bells ringing in my ears. We talked for a while, and I began to understand that the leprechaun was just a trickster, not a malevolent creature. Eventually, he disappeared into the night, leaving me with a newfound respect for the supernatural. I may have had a scary encounter with a leprechaun, but in the end, it turned out to be a valuable lesson in not judging things by appearances and keeping an open mind about the world around us. I'm not one to easily believe in supernatural creatures, but what I saw that night will haunt me forever. It was a typical St. Patrick's Day evening, and my friends and I decided to hit up a local Irish pub for some drinks and festivities. We were having a great time until I stepped outside for some fresh air. As I was standing there, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It was a small figure, about 3 feet tall, dressed in green and sporting a red beard. At first, I thought it was a child playing a prank, but as it got closer, I realized that it wasn't human. It was a leprechaun. I froze in fear as the leprechaun approached me. It had a mischievous grin on its face and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. It spoke in a voice that was both high-pitched and deep at the same time, saying, "Top of the mornin' to ya. Do ya have a pot of gold for me?" I was too scared to move or speak, and before I knew it, the leprechaun vanished into thin air. I rushed back inside to tell my friends what had happened, but they just laughed it off, thinking I was pulling a prank on them. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening to me. My possessions would go missing, and I would find them in bizarre places. I would hear unexplained noises in my house at night, and I even saw glimpses of the leprechaun lurking around outside. I knew that I had to do something, so I consulted a local psychic who specialized in dealing with supernatural beings. She told me that leprechauns were notorious tricksters who enjoyed tormenting humans for their amusement. She gave me some protective charms to wear and told me to recite a special incantation if I ever saw the leprechaun again. Days turned into weeks, and I thought that maybe the leprechaun had finally given up on me. But then, on another St. Patrick's Day, I saw him again. He was standing in the middle of the street, taunting me with his cackling laughter. I did what the psychic had instructed me to do and recited the incantation. The leprechaun let out a blood-curdling scream and vanished into thin air once again. I haven't seen or heard from him since that day, but I still get chills thinking about that encounter. So if you ever see a leprechaun, be warned, they're not the friendly, lucky beings that pop culture would have you believe. They're malevolent creatures who enjoy causing chaos and misery for their own amusement. And if you're ever unlucky enough to cross their path, you better be prepared to fight for your life. I had always heard stories about leprechauns growing up, but I never believed them to be true. That was until I had my own encounter with one. It was a warm summer night, and I had just finished my shift at the local bar. As I was walking home, I heard a faint whistling sound coming from the nearby woods. I didn't think much of it at first, but the whistling grew louder and more persistent, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to investigate. As I entered the woods, the whistling stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I was about to turn back when I saw a small figure standing in front of me. At first, I thought it was a child, but as I got closer, I realized it was a leprechaun. He was small, with a green suit and hat, and his eyes were shining bright like gold coins. He looked friendly enough, and I felt at ease in his presence. "Hello there," he said in a high-pitched voice. "What brings you to my woods?" I explained that I was just passing by and heard his whistling. He smiled and offered to show me around. I accepted, and we began to walk deeper into the woods. As we walked, I noticed that the trees and bushes around us were changing shape and color. They looked more vivid and alive, almost as if they were enchanted. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I felt like I was in a dream. Suddenly, the leprechaun stopped in front of a large oak tree. "This is where I live," he said, pointing to a small door at the base of the tree. "Would you like to come in for a drink?" I hesitated for a moment, but my curiosity got the best of me. I followed the leprechaun inside the tree, and I was amazed by what I saw. The interior was decorated with gold coins and jewels, and there was a small table with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. We sat down, and the leprechaun poured us each a glass. As we drank, he told me stories about his life in the woods and his love of mischief. I laughed and enjoyed his company, feeling grateful for this unexpected adventure. But as the night wore on, I started to feel uneasy. The leprechaun's stories became darker and more sinister, and I realized that he wasn't as friendly as I had thought. He started to cackle and dance around the room, and I felt like I was in the middle of a nightmare. Suddenly, he lunged at me, and I knew I had to get out of there. I pushed him away and ran towards the door. I felt his tiny hands grabbing at my ankles, but I managed to break free and sprint out of the tree. As I ran through the woods, I could hear the leprechaun's laughter behind me. It echoed through the trees, and I knew he was chasing me. But I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my home. I never spoke of my encounter with the leprechaun to anyone, but I know what I saw was real. And every time I walk by those woods, I can still hear his whistling and laughter, reminding me that some legends are true, and some adventures are best left unexplored. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to leprechauns, the little men with their pots of gold and their mischievous ways. But after what I experienced last St. Patrick's Day, I'm not so sure anymore. It was a typical March evening. I had just finished a late shift at work and was walking home. The streets were deserted, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the trees. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the end of the road. At first, I thought it was just a drunk stumbling home from a party, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. The figure was small, no more than 4 feet tall, and was dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned suit. His face was twisted into a sinister grin, and he was holding a small pot in his hand. It was a leprechaun. I froze in terror, not knowing what to do. The leprechaun started to move towards me, and as he did, I noticed something odd about him. His movements were jerky and unnatural, almost like he wasn't quite solid. I turned to run, but the leprechaun was fast. He was right behind me, giggling and cackling as he chased me through the streets. It felt like hours before I finally made it back to my apartment building, my heart pounding in my chest. I thought that was the end of it, but that's when things got really strange. Over the next few days, I started to notice things missing from my apartment, a few dollars here, a piece of jewelry there. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw the leprechaun again. He was standing outside my window, grinning that sinister grin and holding my stolen goods in his hand. I was scared out of my mind, but I knew I had to confront him. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, ready to give him a piece of my mind. But when I got outside, the leprechaun was gone, leaving behind only his pot of gold. I don't know what to make of it all. Maybe it was just a prank, or maybe there really are leprechauns out there. All I know is that I'm never walking home alone on St. Patrick's Day again. I never believed in the supernatural until I had an encounter with a leprechaun. It happened last St. Patrick's Day when my friends and I went on a pub crawl in a small town in Ireland. We were having a great time, drinking green beer and singing along to Irish folk songs when we stumbled upon a clearing in the woods. That's when we saw him. A small figure with a green top hat and red beard was sitting on a rock, tinkering with something in his hands. At first, we thought it was just a guy dressed up for the holiday, but as we got closer, we could see that he was no ordinary man. His skin was a pale green, and his eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. And when he looked up at us, I swear I felt a chill go down my spine. He didn't speak, but he held out a small pot of gold coins, offering them to us. My friends were eager to take the treasure, but something about the leprechaun made me feel uneasy. I declined, and the leprechaun let out a high-pitched cackle before disappearing in a puff of smoke. We tried to shake it off, blaming it on the alcohol, but things only got worse from there. We heard strange noises in the woods and felt like we were being watched. And then, one of my friends disappeared. We searched frantically for him, but it was like he vanished into thin air. That's when I knew that the leprechaun was not to be trifled with. We left the woods as quickly as we could, and I made sure to never accept anything from a leprechaun again. It's been a year since that incident, but I still have nightmares about the leprechaun. And every St. Patrick's Day, I make sure to stay far away from any woods or fields where he might be lurking. Because if you see a leprechaun, it's best to run the other way and not look back. I never believed in leprechauns. To me, they were just fictional characters from Irish folklore. But one day, that all changed. It was a warm summer evening, and I was out for a walk in the countryside. I decided to take a shortcut through a meadow, and that's when I saw him. A tiny man, no more than a foot tall, dressed in green and sporting a pointed hat. At first, I thought it was a toy or a statue, but then it moved. I froze in place, unable to comprehend what was happening. The leprechaun looked up at me with beady eyes, and then it spoke. "Ah, it's a human. What are you doing in my meadow?" Its voice was high-pitched and mischievous. I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there, staring at the creature. The leprechaun chuckled. "You're a curious one, aren't you? Well, let me tell you a secret. If you catch me, I'll grant you 3 wishes." I didn't believe him, of course. But I was intrigued by the offer. I decided to play along and chase after the leprechaun. It was like chasing a firefly. The leprechaun darted and weaved through the grass, always just out of reach. I stumbled and fell a few times, but I kept chasing after it. And then, suddenly, it disappeared. I looked around, but I couldn't see it anywhere. I was about to give up when I heard a voice behind me. "Are you tired yet, human?" I spun around, and there was the leprechaun, perched on a mushroom. "Did you give up?" it taunted. "No," I said, panting. "I'm still here." The leprechaun chuckled. "Well then, I suppose you deserve your wishes. What do you want?" I thought for a moment, then said, "I want to be rich." The leprechaun cackled. "Is that all? Very well, you'll find a bag of gold coins waiting for you when you wake up tomorrow morning." And with that, it disappeared again. The next day, I woke up to find a small sack of gold coins on my doorstep. I couldn't believe it. I had caught a leprechaun, and he had given me my wish. But as time went on, strange things started to happen. Every night, I heard whispering voices outside my window. My dreams were filled with bizarre creatures and dark, twisted landscapes. And worst of all, I could feel something watching me, always just out of sight. I tried to ignore it, but it was always there, lurking in the shadows. And then, one night, I woke up to find the leprechaun sitting on my chest, staring down at me with those beady eyes. "I gave you your wish," it said. "But there's a price to pay. You owe me." And with that, it vanished again. I never saw the leprechaun again, but the nightmares and whispers continued. It was like I had opened a door to something dark and dangerous, and I couldn't close it. Eventually, I had to seek help. I found a woman who claimed to be a psychic, and she performed a ritual to banish the evil spirits that had been haunting me. Since then, things have been better. The nightmares have stopped, and I don't hear the whispers anymore. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel like I'm being watched. And I know that somewhere out there, the leprechaun is still waiting for me to. I never believed in leprechauns until one fateful night. It was a warm summer evening, and I was out on a hike with a couple of friends. We had been walking for a few hours when we stumbled upon a clearing in the woods. It was an eerie sight, as the moon cast an eerie light on the area. That's when we saw it, a small figure standing in the center of the clearing. At first, we thought it was just a child playing a prank, but as we got closer, we realized that it was no child. It was a leprechaun. He was small, no more than 2 feet tall, and dressed in green from head to toe. His face was wrinkled, and his eyes glimmered with an otherworldly light. He stood there, staring at us, and for a moment, we were frozen in terror. Then he spoke. "Top of the morning to you, lads," he said, his voice a high-pitched, sing-songy tone. "What brings ye to my neck of the woods?" We were too stunned to respond, and the leprechaun continued to speak. "I see ye been out on a wee hike. But ye shouldn't be wandering in these parts at night. There are dangers here ye can't imagine." With that, the leprechaun disappeared in a puff of smoke, leaving us standing there in shock. We quickly made our way out of the clearing, and for the rest of the hike, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When we got back to our campsite, we shared our story with our other friends, but they just laughed and dismissed it as a prank. But I know what I saw that night. And I'll never forget the feeling of unease that came with it. From that day on, I never went back to those woods again. I never believed in leprechauns, that is until I had my own encounter with one. It happened a few years ago during a camping trip with my friends. We were deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. We had set up camp near a small stream and spent the day fishing and hiking. As night fell, we built a fire and sat around it, telling ghost stories and roasting marshmallows. That's when we heard it. A soft tapping sound coming from the trees behind us. At first, we thought it was just an animal, but as the tapping grew louder, we realized it was something else entirely. Suddenly, a small figure appeared in front of us, no more than 3 feet tall. It had a green hat, a red beard, and a coat with gold buttons. It was a leprechaun. My friends and I were stunned. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. The leprechaun smiled at us and said, "Hello there, lads. What brings you to my neck of the woods?" We were speechless. We didn't know what to say. The leprechaun continued to talk to us, telling us stories of his travels and adventures. He seemed friendly enough, but there was something unsettling about him. His eyes were cold and calculating, and his smile never reached his eyes. As the night went on, the leprechaun grew more and more agitated. He began to demand that we give him something in exchange for his stories. We didn't know what he wanted, but we were afraid to refuse him. That's when I noticed something odd about his shoes. They were made of solid gold. I pointed them out to my friends, and we realized that this was what he was after. The leprechaun was trying to trick us into giving him something valuable. We quickly packed up our things and left the campsite, making sure to keep our eyes on the leprechaun the entire time. He followed us for a while, but eventually disappeared back into the woods. We never spoke of the leprechaun again, but we all knew that what we had seen was real. It was a terrifying experience, one that we will never forget. I never thought I would believe in leprechauns, but after that night, I know they exist, and they are not to be trusted. I've always been fascinated by Irish folklore, particularly tales of leprechauns and their hidden pots of gold. But after what I experienced last St. Patrick's Day, I can tell you with certainty that these mythical creatures are not to be trifled with. It was a typical March evening, and I had just left my office after a long day at work. I was walking home, enjoying the cool breeze and admiring the festive decorations around town, when something caught my eye. Up ahead, I saw a small figure dart behind a tree. At first, I thought it was just a child playing hide and seek, but as I got closer, I realized that it was something else entirely. Standing there in the shadows was a leprechaun, about 3 feet tall and dressed in a green suit with a matching top hat. His eyes were a piercing blue, and he had a mischievous grin on his face. I froze in terror, not sure what to do. The leprechaun beckoned me to come closer, and I felt compelled to obey. As I approached him, he handed me a small, shimmering piece of gold. I couldn't believe it. I had always dreamed of finding a leprechaun's treasure. But as soon as I took the gold, the leprechaun vanished into thin air. Suddenly, the air grew cold, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew then that I had made a terrible mistake. I had heard stories of leprechauns who tricked humans into taking their gold, only to curse them with bad luck for the rest of their lives. Sure enough, over the next few weeks, I experienced a string of unfortunate events. I lost my job, my car broke down, and I even got food poisoning. It wasn't until I returned the gold to the spot where I had encountered the leprechaun that my luck finally turned around. But I'll never forget that eerie encounter, and I always keep an eye out for any other supernatural beings that might be lurking in the shadows. I've always heard stories about leprechauns, but I never believed they were real. That is until I had my own experience with one. It was a warm summer night, and I was walking home from a friend's house. As I walked down the street, I noticed a small figure sitting on the sidewalk. As I got closer, I realized it was a leprechaun. At first, I thought it was a child dressed up for a costume party or something, but as I got closer, I realized it was no child. This leprechaun was about 2 feet tall, with wrinkled skin and a long white beard. He was wearing a green hat and a suit, just like the ones you see in the movies. I stopped in my tracks and stared at him. He looked up at me with his bright green eyes and smiled. I was so shocked that I couldn't move. Suddenly, the leprechaun spoke, "Greetings, mortal. Would you like to make a deal?" I couldn't believe my ears. Was this really happening? What kind of deal? I asked cautiously. "I will grant you 3 wishes if you can catch me," the leprechaun said with a mischievous grin. Without thinking, I took off running after him. He ran down the street and into a dark alley. I followed him, but as I turned the corner, he disappeared into thin air. I stood there, panting and confused. What just happened? Suddenly, I heard a low growling noise. It was coming from the shadows. I turned around and saw 2 glowing eyes staring back at me. It was the leprechaun, but he looked different. He was no longer smiling. His eyes were filled with malice. "Your wishes are mine now," he hissed. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The leprechaun started to move towards me, and I could feel his cold breath on my face. Just as he was about to reach me, a car drove down the street, illuminating the alley with its headlights. The leprechaun disappeared into the shadows, and I was finally able to move. I ran home as fast as I could, and when I got there, I collapsed onto my bed. I couldn't believe what had just happened. From that day on, I never walked down that street again. I never spoke of my encounter with the leprechaun until now, and even now, I'm still afraid of what might happen if he ever shows up again. I never believed in leprechauns, but that changed one fateful night. It was a warm summer evening, and I was walking home from my friend's house. As I walked through the park, I heard a strange noise. It sounded like someone was laughing, but it was a high-pitched, almost shrill laugh. I turned around to see where the noise was coming from, and that's when I saw him. A tiny man, no more than a foot tall, dressed in green clothes and a top hat, was standing on a nearby tree stump. He had a mischievous grin on his face and was holding a pot of gold. At first, I thought it was a prank, but the longer I stared at him, the more I realized that this was no ordinary prank. He was a leprechaun, and he was looking right at me. I couldn't believe my eyes. I rubbed them, thinking it was a trick of the light, but when I opened them again, he was still there, grinning at me. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if I was rooted to the spot. The leprechaun hopped down from the stump and started walking towards me, his eyes locked on mine. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as he approached, his laughter echoing through the park. I closed my eyes, expecting the worst, but when I opened them again, he was gone. I ran all the way home, my mind racing with questions. Was it real? Was I hallucinating? I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened, something that I couldn't explain. The next morning, I woke up to find a pile of gold coins on my bedside table. I knew then that what I had seen was real, and that the leprechaun had left me a gift. I never saw him again, but I'll never forget that night. It's a memory that still haunts me to this day, and one that I'll never forget. I never believed in the supernatural, but my encounter with a leprechaun changed everything. It was a warm spring evening, and I was walking home from work when I saw something strange in the park. At first, I thought it was just a little person dressed in green, but as I got closer, I realized it was something much more sinister. The creature was about 3 feet tall with a wrinkled face and pointed ears. It had a mischievous grin on its face, and its eyes seemed to twinkle with an otherworldly light. As I approached, the leprechaun beckoned me over with a wave of its hand. It spoke in a thick Irish accent, and its voice had a sing-song quality that made me feel uneasy. "Come over here, laddie, and I'll give you a pot of gold," it said. I was about to turn and run when the leprechaun reached into its pocket and pulled out a gold coin. It glinted in the moonlight, and I couldn't resist its lure. I took a step closer, and that's when things got really strange. The leprechaun's face contorted into a grotesque grin, and it lunged at me with surprising speed. I stumbled backward, but it was no use. The creature had me in its grasp, and I was powerless to resist. It dragged me into the nearby woods, and I could hear its high-pitched laughter echoing all around me. I stumbled over roots and fallen branches, and I was sure that this was it, I was going to be its next victim. But just as I thought all hope was lost, I remembered something my grandfather had told me. "Leprechauns are tricky, but they can be beaten," he had said. "All you need is a 4-leaf clover and a bit of courage." I quickly scanned the forest floor and spotted a patch of clover. I plucked a leaf from it and held it up like a shield. The leprechaun snarled and backed away, clearly intimidated by my newfound confidence. With a final laugh, the creature disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone in the woods. I stumbled home, shaken but alive, and I vowed never to underestimate the supernatural again. I've always heard stories about leprechauns growing up in Ireland, but I never really believed in them. That is until I had my own encounter. It was a warm summer evening, and I was walking home from a friend's house. I decided to take a shortcut through the woods, thinking it would save me some time. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was a child, maybe a little person, dressed in green. But as I got closer, I could see that it was no child. It was a leprechaun, just like the ones my grandmother used to tell me about. He was short, maybe 3 feet tall, with a wrinkled face and a long white beard. He wore a green jacket, black pants, and had a hat on his head. His eyes were a piercing green, and they seemed to glow in the darkness. I froze, not sure what to do. The leprechaun looked up at me and smiled, revealing his sharp teeth. "Well, hello there, young lad," he said in a thick Irish accent. "What brings you into the woods at this hour?" I couldn't speak, I was so scared. The leprechaun just kept smiling, and then he disappeared into thin air. I was left standing there alone, wondering if I had just imagined it all. The next day, I told my friends about my encounter, but they didn't believe me. They thought I was making it up, but I knew what I had seen. I never took that shortcut through the woods again, and I never saw the leprechaun again. But every time I hear stories about leprechauns now, I get a chill down my spine. I know they're real, and I'm just glad that I lived to tell the tale. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it's been almost a year. I was hiking through the woods on St. Patrick's Day, enjoying the fresh air and the beautiful scenery. I didn't believe in leprechauns or anything like that, but I was about to have a very scary encounter. As I walked along the trail, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. I shrugged it off and kept walking, but then I saw it again, this time in front of me. It was a small, humanoid creature, about 3 feet tall, with a green coat and a pointy hat. It looked like a leprechaun. I froze, not sure what to do. The leprechaun stared at me with its beady eyes, and then it started to run towards me. I turned and ran in the opposite direction, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear its tiny footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. I don't know how long I ran for, but eventually, I stumbled and fell to the ground. I looked up and saw the leprechaun standing over me, its face twisted into a wicked grin. It pulled out a tiny knife and held it to my throat, and I knew I was in serious trouble. But then something strange happened. The leprechaun started to laugh, and then it disappeared into thin air. I sat there, panting and shaking, not sure if what had just happened was real or not. I made it back to my car and drove home, still in shock. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened, thinking they would never believe me. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget that terrifying encounter with the leprechaun. From that day on, I always carry a 4-leaf clover with me when I go hiking. You never know what kind of creatures you might encounter in the woods, and it's better to be safe than sorry. I still get chills thinking about the day I saw a leprechaun. I know, it sounds ridiculous, but I swear it's true. It happened a few years ago, when I was out hiking in the Irish countryside. I had been wandering for a couple of hours, taking in the stunning views and enjoying the fresh air, when I stumbled upon a small, secluded clearing. It was a beautiful spot, with a little stream trickling through the middle, surrounded by tall trees and lush greenery. As I was admiring the scene, I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it again, a small, shadowy figure darting between the trees. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but the feeling of unease persisted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Suddenly, I heard a faint tinkling sound, like bells jingling in the distance. I strained my ears, trying to locate the source of the noise, but it seemed to be coming from all around me. That's when I saw it. A tiny, old man with a long, white beard and a mischievous twinkle in his eye was standing at the edge of the clearing, beckoning me over with a gnarled finger. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be real, could it? Leprechauns weren't real. But the longer I stared at the creature, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just a figment of my imagination. The leprechaun stepped closer, his little feet pattering on the ground as he approached me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except watch in terror as he came closer and closer. But then, just as he was about to reach me, the bells stopped ringing, and he disappeared into thin air. I was left standing alone in the clearing, shaking and sweating, unable to comprehend what had just happened. I still don't know what to make of that experience. Maybe it was just a trick of the mind, or maybe there really are leprechauns out there, lurking in the shadows and watching us. All I know is that I never want to see one again. I've always been skeptical about supernatural creatures and urban legends, but one incident changed my entire perspective. It happened a few years ago, but the memory still haunts me to this day. It was St. Patrick's Day, and my friends and I decided to celebrate by attending a local parade. After the festivities ended, we headed to a nearby pub to grab some drinks. As we walked into the dimly lit establishment, we noticed an old man sitting in the corner, staring intently at a small green hat placed on the table in front of him. Being the curious bunch we were, we struck up a conversation with him. He told us that he was of Irish descent and that the hat belonged to a leprechaun that he had encountered in the nearby woods many years ago. We all laughed and thought he was pulling our leg, but as he continued to speak, we realized he was completely serious. He told us about how he had been wandering in the woods, looking for a place to fish when he stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center of the clearing, he saw a tiny man with pointed ears, wearing a green suit and hat. He was sure it was a leprechaun. The old man said he tried to capture the leprechaun, thinking it would bring him luck and riches, but the creature proved to be too quick and elusive. He eventually gave up and left the woods empty-handed, but ever since that day, strange things had been happening to him. He claimed to hear cackling laughter in the middle of the night and found his belongings moved around the house as if someone had been playing pranks on him. We were all amused by the story and laughed it off, but as we left the pub and walked towards our cars, we suddenly heard a high-pitched laughter coming from the nearby woods. At first, we thought it was just someone messing around, but the laughter grew louder and more sinister. That's when we saw him, a small figure darting between the trees, dressed in green and with pointed ears. It was a leprechaun, just like the old man had described. We froze in terror as the creature approached us, cackling and hissing. Its eyes were glowing with an otherworldly light, and we could hear it whispering in an ancient language that we couldn't understand. We were paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, the leprechaun vanished, and the laughter faded away. We were left standing there, trembling and wondering if what we had just experienced was real or just a product of our imagination. Years have passed since that fateful night, but I can't shake off the feeling that we were visited by something truly supernatural. I still avoid going near those woods, and I hope I never encounter the leprechaun again. I've always loved Ireland, its green hills and lively pubs. But after what happened to me, I can't look at that place the same way again. It was St. Patrick's Day, and I decided to visit a friend who lived in a remote cottage outside of Dublin. I didn't know the way, so I relied on my GPS. As I drove, the mist thickened, and the trees grew taller and sparser. The road turned from paved to gravel to dirt, and I wondered if I was going the right way. But I kept going. Eventually, I saw a figure on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a child, but as I got closer, I saw that it was something else entirely. It was small, with a pointed hat and a bright green coat. It was a leprechaun. I slammed on the brakes, and the car screeched to a stop. The leprechaun turned its head and looked at me with its beady eyes. It smiled, revealing sharp teeth. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was no ordinary leprechaun. It was a fairy, one of the dangerous kind. I had heard stories about them, how they could lead you astray or steal your soul. I tried to drive away, but my car wouldn't start. The leprechaun just stood there, watching me. Then it started to laugh, a high-pitched cackle that echoed through the forest. I was trapped. I didn't know what to do. I tried to call my friend, but there was no signal. I was alone, with a fairy on St. Patrick's Day. The leprechaun started to dance, and I saw more figures emerge from the trees. They were all fairies, with twisted faces and sharp claws. They surrounded my car, tapping on the windows and doors. I was terrified. I thought I was going to die. But then I remembered something my grandmother had told me. She said that if you ever see a fairy, you should offer it something valuable. They love shiny things, like gold or silver. I searched my car for something, anything, and finally found a silver locket. I held it out the window, and the leprechaun snatched it from my hand. It examined it for a moment, then tossed it aside. The fairies disappeared as quickly as they had come, and my car started up again. I drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached my friend's cottage. I never told anyone about what happened that night, but I still have nightmares about it. And whenever I see a leprechaun, I know that it's not just a silly St. Patrick's Day mascot. It's a reminder of the fairies that lurk in the shadows, waiting for their next victim. I never thought I would be telling a story like this. But after what happened last St. Patrick's Day, I can't keep it to myself any longer. I know some people might not believe me, but I swear on my life that it's true. It was a typical March evening, and I was walking home from my friend's house after a night of celebrating St. Paddy's Day. As I walked down the dark, deserted street, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. That's when I saw him. A tiny man, no more than 3 feet tall, dressed in a green suit and hat. He had a mischievous grin on his face and his eyes seemed to glow in the moonlight. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. At first, I thought it was just a drunken hallucination. But as I got closer, the leprechaun spoke to me. His voice was high-pitched and almost musical. He said his name was Seamus and he was looking for his pot of gold. I was terrified, but I tried to stay calm. I asked him what he wanted from me, but he just laughed and disappeared into the bushes. I ran as fast as I could back to my apartment, convinced that I was going insane. The next morning, I woke up to find a tiny green hat sitting on my windowsill. I knew then that I hadn't imagined it all. Seamus the leprechaun was real, and he had been following me. For the next few weeks, I was constantly on edge. Every time I walked down that street, I felt like he was watching me. But eventually, I stopped seeing him. I thought maybe he had moved on to someone else. But last night, on St. Patrick's Day, I saw him again. This time, he wasn't alone. There were 3 other leprechauns with him, all dressed in green and grinning from ear to ear. I tried to run, but they were too fast. They led me to a clearing in the woods, where they had a pot of gold sitting in the middle. They offered to share it with me, but I knew better than to trust them. I managed to escape, but I know they're still out there, waiting for their next victim. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear it's true. If you ever see a leprechaun, run as fast as you can. Don't make the same mistake I did. I had always heard stories of leprechauns growing up, but I never believed they were real. That was until I had my own encounter with one. It was a few years ago, but the memory still sends shivers down my spine. I was hiking alone in the Irish countryside, enjoying the beautiful scenery when I heard what sounded like a faint laughter. I couldn't see anyone around me, but the laughter persisted. It was like it was coming from behind a nearby hill. Curious, I decided to investigate. As I climbed the hill, the laughter grew louder and more distinct. It was almost like a sinister cackle. When I reached the top of the hill, I saw a small, green-clad figure standing in the distance. It was a leprechaun, just as I had heard about in the stories. I froze in fear as the leprechaun began to move towards me. Its eyes were piercing and its smile was wicked. I tried to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The leprechaun seemed to be growing larger and more menacing with every step it took towards me. Just as it was about to grab me, I managed to break free of my fear and turned to run down the hill. As I ran, I could hear the leprechaun's laughter growing fainter behind me. When I finally reached the bottom of the hill and looked back, the leprechaun was nowhere to be seen. I rushed back to my hotel and told the locals what had happened. They looked at me with a mix of fear and disbelief, but I knew what I had seen. I'll never forget that day and the terror that I felt. The leprechaun may be small, but its power is not to be underestimated.